Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar Survey Tips for Librarians with Professor Lesley Andres from the University of British Columbia. My name is Melissa Crowley and I am the Senior Marketing Manager for SAGE Research Methods here at SAGE. Let me begin by introducing you to our speaker. Lesley is Professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia. Her research focuses on the sociology of higher education, issues of inequality and access, transitions across the life course, and mixed methods survey research design. Her most recent books are Designing and Doing Survey Research and The Making of a Generation, Children of the 1970s in Adulthood. She is also featured in our new collection, SAGE Research Methods video. This 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to our speaker throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag SageTalks and feel free to ask questions or leave.
So I think it's over to me now. Thank you very much for joining us today, or joining me today. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, and it's typically rainy. Hopefully the rain won't drown out the sound. I've been a survey researcher for a very long time, and I hope I can share some tips with you. I've never dealt with librarians specifically, but I've tried to tailor my talk to address some issues that you might encounter or might be of concern to you. So I thought it would help if I just started out with assumptions. So what are my assumptions about you? My first assumption is that you're interested in doing practical research, not research for research's sake. You want to learn about your various constituents, so it's in-house, practice-oriented projects that you would focus on. The second assumption is that you're actually interested in finding out the habits, attitudes, and concerns of the library community. So you want to know what goes on in the library, what people are happy with, what people might not be so happy with, or to understand their concerns and how you can actually improve the library community. My third assumption is that you will have limited resources in terms of time and money. Often these projects are done off the side of a desk, and little resources are available, and I understand that completely because I work on that assumption applies to me quite often as well. And finally, that you will probably be doing online surveys. There are other options, but I'm assuming that you will try to reach your constituents doing an online survey. So I hope I'm correct in these assumptions. If I'm not, perhaps you can address my inaccurate assumptions in your questions. This is called a research spiral, and it's a survey research spiral that I adapted from other researchers to deal specifically with survey research. And I'm not going to cover all of this today. I teach a whole course on this. But I thought it would be useful if you could see the research spiral, and I think one of the main points to take away from it is everything is interrelated. So when I present and I teach on survey research, of course we have to do it in a linear way, but the point is that everything impacts each other. So when we talk about, say, identifying your research problem? Well, it relates to resources and sample size and availability of the sample. It relates to everything in the circle. So this is a takeaway. You could print it out if you're doing a survey research project, and perhaps try to keep in mind the interrelatedness of all of it. So what constitutes good survey research design? I'm going to highlight some of the key points. The first is to be a content area expert. And it means something, I think, a bit different than the way I usually teach this, because I usually teach a course to graduate students who are interested in conducting a research project. So that, in terms of a librarian audience, I think what I mean is that you're an expert in what goes on in the library. So you really need to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on, and I'm sure you all do by working in the library. The second point is to have a good grasp of sampling theory, and this might sound very daunting, but it really is required. I think many times samples are devised and surveys are sent out in sort of a shotgun fashion, and the results aren't very meaningful because not enough thought has gone into the actual design of the sample. The third, which is related to the first point, is professional, ethical, and political astuteness. So again, having your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the library and the library community, so whether you're at a university or you're in an elementary or secondary school or a public library in a city, to be aware of the political dimensions and the professional dimensions of your circumstance. Next is to be able to write clear questions. Everybody thinks that they can construct a survey, and it's not the case. I collect surveys as a kind of a professional hobby, and it's not at all difficult to share examples with my students about how not to construct questions, even by the academic community. So it's a real art to be able to construct a very clear question on a survey. Next is related to a point in my assumptions, to be able to craft a sound budget and a realistic schedule. So you're probably working with minimal money and minimal time. So the idea here is to be very clear that that's what you're doing, and create a realistic schedule that's in relation to your budget. And finally, you need the skill to conduct statistical or qualitative analyses of the data and prepare reports. And I think this is a forgotten aspect of conducting survey research. So once you send out the surveys and the results come back, you have to do something with them. And it's usually in the form of preparing a report. So it's something to think about before you actually start a survey. Who's going to do this? Who has the skill to do this step? So next I want to focus on identifying the problem and related questions. And I think central to any study is to ask yourself, is survey methodology the right topic at hand? There are many different ways to gather information, and it's important to determine whether a survey approach is the best approach. Surveys are best designed to gather information about description, behavior, attitudes, and opinions. They're not good in terms of speculative information, like what would you do if this were to happen, then what? It's better with a concrete goal in mind in terms of these dimensions. Surveys are also meant to generalize, which means to be able to talk about, to be able to go beyond your sample to other populations, or to be transferred in some way beyond the original sample. And transferability is what we most often do, and I think it sometimes gets forgotten. So we all practice transferability every time we read a report or a research paper or an article, and ask ourselves how we can actually incorporate that into our own practice or our own research. So it's the exact opposite of generalizability. Generalizability is the goal for the person doing the study to choose a sample that can be then generalized to other jurisdictions. Transferability is the opposite, that somebody else reads your own study and uses that information in a meaningful way. So I tried to create a typical research question. It's pretty basic, but just to give you an idea of what you could possibly ask in terms of on a survey for that's related to the library. So what are university students' attitudes toward opening hours at the library? Very basic question. We can build on this question by adding a description. So in this case, it would be a description of the students. We want to know about the university students themselves, their age, gender, and perhaps some other dimensions like income or educational level or family composition. Next, we want to know behavior. We might want to know behavior. It's not necessary. So one behavior could be visiting the library or accessing materials online, for instance. And the third is attitudes and opinions, and this could be views about what constitutes reasonable access. And by adding a few questions like age and gender, you can really expand your survey by combining each of these dimensions. So a relatively short survey can collect a lot of information. Next, I think it's important to anticipate the audience, and the audience isn't your survey sample, the people you're interested in gathering data from, but who's going to read your report. So probably one of the main audiences is the party who commissions the research. So for instance, the head of library services or your university senate. It could be, and most of my examples are based in the university. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. So another example could be a faculty could commission work for you, or perhaps undergraduate or graduate students through their graduate student societies or other ways. But they're your audience. Alumni could be another audience. And the general public is another audience. Sometimes you have intended audiences like the head of the library who commissioned the study, but unintended audiences could be the media or the board of governors. So you need to think about who will gain access to this report. So this leads to another dimension, and this is research and politics. So everything is political. The nature of the questions, you might think your questions are very basic and not political at all, but they can become political. So it's just something to consider when you're doing when you're designing a survey. How could this get out of hand? Gaining access to the research participants can be highly political. I've had many instances where I thought I would be able to gain access to names and addresses at the time or email addresses of a particular survey sample, and I couldn't for various reasons. Securing funding is always complicated, and it can be political. And choosing the type of survey method. When there are many parties involved in say planning a survey or excuse me, planning a survey or helping design a survey, the actual survey method might become quite political. There are different views about what would count as a good survey method. Sharing of the results of the research is also political, as I said, and to have intended audiences and unintended audiences. And sometimes ethics is involved. You have to determine from your own institution whether you need to go through an ethics protocol, and it will differ depending on the institution. And finally, I just want to make one point about designing surveys by committee. This can be an absolute nightmare. It can be complicated enough if like minds are designing the survey. So say people within your own library community are working on a committee. That's complicated enough. But when you have other parties involved or other stakeholders involved, it can be a real disaster. I have one example of a survey done at my university where there were several stakeholders at the table, and the survey had ended up being this piecemeal product with one or two pet questions by each person around the table. And I think it actually started out as a library survey, but that wasn't the end product. Next, I want to talk a bit about the preliminary sampling frame. I'm going to address sampling several times in this short presentation because go back to the research spiral. It's done in a very iterative fashion. First, you have kind of a broad overview of what the samples should be. And the question to ask is who can best answer the research questions posed in this study. So we always start out big in terms of the universe of interest. We forget about our budget, we forget about resources in terms of time and money, and we want to do a grand scale survey. So it could be, for example, a survey of first-year students or faculty members. And then we have to narrow the sample down. So we need to perhaps think about a location, a specific faculty like medicine or arts. Demographic characteristics such as perhaps you want young students, perhaps you want all female students, perhaps you want only full-time students. And any other relevant criteria that is important to your study. So this is kind of the brainstorming phase of your sampling design. So thinking big and working down from ideal to real. So I've taken the question that I posed earlier. Again, as I said, it's a very simple question. This is the ideal question or the universe question, and now I've tried to winnow it down a bit. So what are full-time arts undergraduate university students' attitudes toward the opening hours of the main library? So you can see how I've gotten much more specific in this question, and this is what we need to do. We can't. I mean, when you think about doing a survey of a whole institution, that's pretty daunting, and the results may not be very meaningful. Looking at arts undergraduate students versus medical students, for instance, or elementary students' parents versus senior secondary students' parents, or the community at large. That'd be a very complicated question. Perhaps you want to look at seniors' uses of library or their views about online access, for instance. So it's a matter of narrowing down a question. In terms of specifying the types of survey instruments to be employed, we have to ask a series of questions. So who is the sample? So again, getting back to being more specific about the sample. How many people will be included in the study? I have a longitudinal project. We're in the field right now. I have an 80 right now we have an 87% response rate to the last mail out, but it's a mail out survey. I've been surveying these people for 28 years. The people remaining in the sample know me quite well by now. So I know that they are likely to respond, particularly if I send them a mail-out survey, because I give them a package of goodies when in the survey. So a research report. This time they got a stylus pen as a gift. But it's very costly. Each package costs at least $10. So if you're doing a very large scale survey, then you probably can't afford to do a mail-out survey. And mail-out surveys are pretty well obsolete these days. I had a student in my class last year tell me, excuse me, that she wouldn't know where to find a mailbox, and that confused me completely. Mail is completely off her radar. Do your potential respondents have access to the internet, or perhaps you're going to do a telephone survey? So do they have a telephone? And telephone surveys are complicated now because numbers aren't so readily available. Are they inclined to respond to an internet survey? I think this is a really big question for surveys at institutions these days. I know my students tell me that they're bombarded with internet surveys, and if you just take a minute and think about how many you say no thanks to, whether it's your bank or whether it's a service you're using. So a survey, there's an overuse of internet surveys these days. So will they respond? What is the nature of the questions to be answered? This takes a bit of thought. So are you going to ask mainly closed-ended questions, which mean yes/no questions, or on a scale of 1 to 5 questions? Or would you like more some open-ended questions, or all open-ended questions, which isn't recommended on a survey, to get more in-depth answers to your questions? And what is the desired length of your survey? Is it a short survey? Is it a long survey? My survey is 35, my current survey is 35 pages long. This is not conducive to an internet survey. People give up halfway through. And how important is it to have an interviewer present? Because interviewing is also survey research. You can deliver various types of surveys through interviewers. And if it's important to have somebody there to probe for more detailed information, then you need to think about this. And also the cost of this is expensive. And finally, related to the last point, what is the budget and timeline for the project? So in terms of all these questions, you must think about what is it going to cost and how long is it going to take? I'm going to provide a very quick overview of designing the survey instrument, but I can't say often enough how important it is to be able to craft good questions. If you don't craft good questions, you could end up with a survey that is impossible to interpret. So one way is to borrow from other studies. Get out there, look to see what others have done. It doesn't necessarily need to be in your area or your discipline, but you can see what perhaps other librarians have done or other jurisdictions have done, and see if you can borrow some of those items for your survey. So, for instance, the census is a good source for questions about occupation. There's no point reinventing that question. It exists, and it exists in a way that you can code the results based on a standardized format. So if you borrow, you can modify existing items to suit your own circumstance. But you have to be aware of copyright. So make sure borrowing isn't plagiarized. So that's just something that's an alert for you. You can write your questions from scratch, but then you need to be a good survey researcher and understand the problems related with writing questions. And you need to think about pre-contact information. So you will have letters of introduction or reminder emails, and these need to be prepared as well as part of the survey instrument. So we're back to sample again, I think now for the third time. What type of sample are you going to do? Are you going to do a random sample where you have a database of people and you choose randomly who you will send a survey to? Or a non-random sample? Or both. A non-random sample is where it's the opposite of random. You pick them in some way, or both. So in terms of your sample, you actually need to learn much more about these sampling strategies and what random and non-random means. You will need to decide at some point what the final determination of the sample size is. So what's the final sample? At one point you have to make that decision. And the final choice depends on availability of the sample. What level of accuracy do you want in terms of your results? The amount of time you have, and again, the costs. So time and costs come up over and over again. Next is devising a doable schedule and budget. I've already said a fair bit about this now. So it's important to have a schedule or time frame, and this is something you actually want to excuse me, you want to write out. You want to map it out on a piece of paper. What is your schedule or time frame? You also need to know your sample. If you're in a university, then you don't want to probably do a study of students from May to between May and September, or whatever your academic year is. If you're in an elementary school or secondary school, you need to know when students are actually in class. And if you're dealing with faculty or instructors, you need to know what their busy times are. So it's really important to understand the time rhythm of your sample. You need to map out the entire range of research activity, documenting everything you're going to do along the way. In terms of budget, you need to be very detailed in your budget and realistic. So when my students create a budget the first time, they learn very quickly that they can't afford to spend $10,000 on their survey. So they really need to rethink what they've done. So now we've assumed that the survey instrument has been prepared, and the next step is piloting. Piloting is really critical because we need to ensure several things. First, that your respondents can understand the language you've used, that the language is appropriate and understandable to the audience. And it's quite amazing what people don't actually understand. I mean, sometimes we get caught up in our own jargon and we assume that people will understand it and they don't. Or even simple questions or simple words like cohabitation in relation to marital status. My students didn't understand when I piloted my survey one time. The pilot's respondents did not understand the word cohabitation. You need to assess whether the questions are understood as intended. So you actually want to administer the survey and then talk about it afterwards. So are they answering the way that you intend them to answer? You can test different versions of a question, and this might be going back to survey by committee, that if there are different ways of thinking about asking a question, you can test different versions to see which one is the best choice. This is a point particular to online surveys. You need to determine whether the questions are logical and whether the skip instructions are correct. So when you set up an online survey, if somebody answers no to a question, then the next 5 questions might not be relevant. So they don't need to look at those questions. But you really want to make sure that questions that aren't intended to be skipped are not skipped. So that you have to be very careful about this. So how do you pilot? There are different methods. One is to pilot with experts, which probably means your colleagues or people who are an expert in the topic at hand. You could have focus groups. If your survey sample, say, is undergraduate students, you could have focus groups to do the survey and talk about the survey. You might have missed something very important that is of particular relevance to them. This might have a cost involved, but actually paying students $10 is a good way to get them to come and participate in your focus group. And you want people who are similar to the intended sample because you want to be as close to the intended sample as possible in terms of giving you feedback. This might not be the case with experts, but then you need another level like focus groups. Another way to pilot your survey is to actually create the coding scheme for data entry. So the data will be entered, it may be entered automatically for an online survey, but you can use a spreadsheet, you could use Excel and create a coding scheme, and you actually pick up a lot of problems when you do this. It's sort of an advanced way of piloting, but it's good practice. And if you're going with interviewers, you need to train them, and you need to train them very carefully because the interviews shouldn't be asking leading questions or changing the wording of surveys. So you need to decide what the role of the interviewer is and then train the interviewer. Okay, so now we're at administering the survey. Again, you need a detailed plan, and you need to stick to that. So back to the point about knowing your sample. So if you delay your survey, you may run into problems that your sample is no longer available. So stay with your detailed plan, ensure that it's followed, and if for some reason you have to deviate from your sample, like in my case with my mail-out survey is a postal strike, then you really need to rethink the timing of the survey again. In most instances, it's important that people are anonymous and you maintain the confidentiality of the sample. So this is back to ethics, and this is something you will have to determine with your institution. But you usually don't reveal the participants in our studies, their identity. And I mentioned ethics requirements. It's a good idea to keep records, to remind yourself what you're doing along the way. So that's a sort of a journal about your study, because you forget. You're busy people, and you just forget what you've done. So keep records about how the administration of the survey has progressed. Another step that's often forgotten is the actual what you do with the results of the survey. So it's a good idea to anticipate what you're going to do once data start coming in. So first, as I've already mentioned, a coding scheme. You need a coding scheme to enter the data. If it's done automatically by the type of online service you use, you probably need to think about that in advance just to make sure you get the data in the form that you want it. You need a plan for cleaning up the data. So there are often errors in data entry, so you need to plan for that. You need to plan and also plan for analyzing open-ended questions or interview data. This is very time-consuming, so again, it costs money. Open-ended questions are great. I'm a great proponent of open-ended questions, but you have to do something with them, and that's manual labor. Somebody needs to enter this information and it costs money. And I think we're close to the end now. In terms of preparing for analysis, you need to, back to one of the earlier slides, you need to determine whether you possess the skills needed to complete the report. And I could back up now and say you need to determine whether you possess the skills to do every part of this study. Survey research is extremely complex. So if you don't have these skills, then the question is, who does? Could you possibly hire students to do the work? There are many talented students around who have these skills. Faculty members, like, I'm not suggesting you ask me, but faculty members like me who are experts on survey research design, or perhaps your institutional research office, because they have skilled analysts who would have all these, would have the skills that you need. And the software as well. It's something I haven't mentioned, that you're going to need software to do the analysis, and software is expensive, and it demands a fairly high skill level to use it. And also building in adequate time for report completion. Most people need 2 months between today and tomorrow. And I assume you're all extremely busy, and there's a lot of demands on your time. So think about this in terms of building in time to write a report. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to entertain your questions.
Thank you, Lesley. This is Melissa again.
Hello.
Get this. Hi. I'm just getting the slide set up. So again, if you have any questions, you can send it in through the Q&A box or the hashtag SageTalks over Twitter. Our first question is, when borrowing from other surveys, is there any need to acknowledge the original survey?
Yes, I think so. I think on the safe side, I often have requests for my survey, so I will give them, I will give my surveys to people. I think it's a good idea to do that, just as a safeguard from being accused of plagiarism down the road. Survey researchers are kind of an odd bunch. We actually like other people to use our questions, because it just helps strengthen survey research all around. So I think if you borrowed items from another survey and contacted the person, they'd probably be very happy to help you. That's my experience.
Great. Well, we're waiting for more questions to come in. We actually have some questions for our audience. So I'm going to ask my colleague Tiffany to go ahead and put up our polls. We're just curious to see what people's job functions are and where you're calling in from today. So we have a second question. I have permission in an email to repurpose their survey. Should I also mention it in the report?
Yeah, it wouldn't hurt to mention it in the acknowledgement section of the report. Why not? It's not necessary to include it on the actual survey. I never do that, but I think it's a nice gesture to include it somewhere in the report as a footnote or in the acknowledgements.
Okay. So I have a follow-up question as we're talking about borrowing from other surveys. I think a lot of times we see the same types of questions in a lot of different surveys. So are there any special definitions of plagiarism when it comes to a survey?
I think it really depends on the question. I think in terms of a census, I don't think there's any problem using questions from a census. I mentioned occupation, because occupation's a great question to use from a census, because it's been tested, it's been designed by a team of experts on the topic, and well, I think all countries, Canada, U.S., Australia, UK, will have a standard coding scheme that helps immensely. Tell me, I'm sorry, I've lost your question. Tell me again.
We were just asking if there were any special plagiarism rules that are specific to surveys.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you ask a gender question, are you male, female, that's so standard that those types of questions, there are no rules. If you're taking a question directly from somebody else, then I think you just you need to contact them and ask permission. I've never heard of a survey researcher being accused of plagiarism, but yeah, the world's changing.
Great, so we have another question from the audience. What is a good size for sampling, or at least how many participants are needed in a survey?
It really depends on the question. I think it's easier to answer that from an analysis perspective. Usually the rule of thumb for any variable, you should have at least 20. So, so if you're doing cross-tabulation, and often in reports, particularly government reports, you can't really report cells, so if say just a simple age by gender cross-tabulation under 5. So you want to ensure that you have a sample size large enough to work with if you're going to construct a quantitative report. It's just simply not very useful to have a sample size of 10, especially for a survey design. That requires another approach. So it really depends on who your survey respondents are. So if you're at a university, for instance, and you're dealing with arts undergraduate students, you want to. There are power calculations you can do, and any standard book will tell you how to do that. But I kind of would say as large as possible without. It's such a complicated question. It requires a whole course, or at least a whole class on it, because on one hand, there's a kind of a view that we'll send out surveys to everybody, and if 10% respond, that's okay. Well, it isn't okay, because the 10% aren't going to be representative of the population. So it's better to try to determine the population, who is the population of interest, and then pick a sample size, say 20% or 30%, who will be representative of that population. It might require oversampling for some dimensions. For instance, if you are interested in capturing indigenous population, an indigenous population in your sample, then you might have to survey 100% of that group, any small group, and then go after that sample. So if you decide that you're going to sample 20 or 30% of your population, then you really target that population and go after them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned earlier with your mail-out survey that you're sending a small gift with the survey for participants. Are there any circumstances when surveyors should be cautious of offering incentives?
Well, this might be a question for ethics. You're an ethics committee. If incentives are too large, then ethics committees will ask the researcher to rethink about it. So there's a fine line between incentive and coercion. And I've seen some studies where it was almost impossible to say no because the incentive was so large. Who would give up $500 for half a day of work? We don't have. I don't have that type of money to offer my respondents. But I think I always feel a small gift goes a long way. I've included fridge magnets, Post-it notes, customized Post-it notes, and this last time a stylus pen. And I think respondents really appreciate that, and the research shows to do that up front. So rather than say, if you answer this survey, I'll give you $10, you'll get a better result by including a dollar in the survey. For a long time ago, I used to get surveys from this Canadian broadcast system, and it was a diary type of survey where you logged what you listened to on the radio for a week or what you watched on television for a week, and they always taped, in Canada, our dollar bills or coins, and they always taped a coin on it, and it was, I mean, it'd say, oh, they gave me $1, I have to do this for them. So I think surveys or incentives are really important if you want a good response rate. And there are other incentives too. I always, with my respondents, I always include my latest research report, and they're very happy to receive that.
Great. We'll give a minute for any last questions to come in from the audience. In the meantime, I just want to put up this slide. We have Lesley's book on designing and doing survey research, and we have a 30% discount code available when you order the book from sagepub.com that expires on November 30th. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Lesley for taking the time out to give this talk today. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that includes a link to view the entire webinar and slides, as well as answers to some of the questions that we'll capture in a blog post. So you can watch our blog, Sage Connections, for more information about upcoming webinars. So thank you all, and with that, we will sign off.